Welcome to the Design Mind Frogcast. Each episode, we go behind the scenes to meet the people designing what's next in the world of products, services, and experiences, both here at Frog and far, far outside the pond. I'm Elizabeth Wood. Today in our show, we're talking about behaviors, or more specifically, the science behind behavior change. Behavioral science is a study of human actions that has roots in many different domains, from economics to psychology, biology, and neuroscience. To talk about behaviors, we're joined by Matt Wallaert, head of behavioral science at Frog, and author of the book Start at the End: How to Build Products That Create Change. Along with training his fellow frogs in the principles and applications of behavioral science, Matt works on multidisciplinary teams to guide clients in improving their own behavioral science capabilities, with a focus on making things that make change. Here's Matt now.
Science belongs to all of us. It's the most beautiful designed thing, as far as I know, that the world has ever created. Right? We've designed lots of stuff, right? People can go talk about the Sistine Chapel, but to me, science is it. I mean, it is gorgeous because it is usable by everyone. We all can do it, and it is inherently egalitarian, and I love that about it. We don't change behavior directly. I can't pop open your brain and find the listen to this podcast button and hit it. Neuroscientists might get us there one day, but it's certainly not how we work today. Instead, what I modify is those pressures, those promoting and inhibiting pressures. What I'm really saying is, how do I change these pressures that then change this behavior? It's a little bit like the Matrix. I love it as an analogy for this kind of work. If you think about the Matrix, there's an outcome, right? Somebody moving in the world or something, and then there's the code behind it, the thing that caused that to occur. We don't directly affect the outcome. What we really do is manipulate the code. We change those promoting and inhibiting pressures to then cause that outcome to occur. There's that wonderful scene with a little kid who says, it's not the spoon that bends, it's you. That's how behavior change works. We don't change behavior directly, we change pressures that then change behavior at scale. My name is Matt Wallaert, and I am the head of behavioral science at Frog. We talk about applied behavioral science as behavior as an outcome, science as a process. So rather than using things that were derived through science in a lab, we're using science in situ to find interventions that work. When I talk about being an applied behavioral scientist, that's what I mean. It's about finding interventions in the world that specifically change behavior as an outcome, using the scientific method to get us to that place of the right cost-benefit ratio to scale it in a way that helps people.
Matt found his way to behavioral science through a combination of academic exploration and an examination of his own lived experiences.
I went into college as a biology major and somewhat fervently anti-psychology. I was raised in rural Oregon. I don't know that there was a psychologist within 100 miles of me. I think my dominant understanding of what psychology was, someone that you went to and they told you how you felt. And that didn't seem like something I was super interested in. And then I took intro psych. As a teenager, I had an eating disorder. And so I ended up taking this second psych class called the Psychology of Self-Control. And it was taught by one of Swarthmore's sort of acknowledged best teaching professors, a guy named Andrew Ward. And sort of midway through the semester, there was a study where I felt like the experimenters were overreaching, that they had reached a conclusion that was not supported by the data. And Andrew said what I think is one of the most wonderful things you can say to a young person, which is, well, the field agrees on this interpretation. But there's an orderly way to respond, which is for you to run your own experiment and prove where you think that there is a nuance or a difference or a problem. And if you want to come to my lab and run an experiment, let's do that. And that was just huge for me. I mean, I think up until that point in my life, the most powerful person in the room had the freedom to articulate and to decide what right meant. And here was this professor saying, no, there's a very different way of understanding and deciding what right means, and you can be engaged in that in an orderly way. And I just loved it. I was totally hooked. And I just started running things in his lab and started taking more psych classes and, graduated from Swarthmore, worked in Andrew's lab, worked in another lab. And then, as was sort of natural for that path, was like, okay, off I go to grad school. I got to Cornell, and after a year, I was like, this is not it. And the real problem was, I could do all the research in the world, but I wasn't confident that if I did all the research in the world, anything would change for the people that I care about. I'm a first-generation college kid, and I have this really big focus on sort of the bottom third of the socioeconomic pyramid. And I just wasn't confident that if I wrote papers until I was blue in the face, that anything would change for those people. So I left, and I joined a startup as the head of product. At the time, behavioral science was still very much a new field. my career just started building from there. I became the head of behavioral science at Microsoft, and then the chief behavioral officer at someplace called Clover Health, and now the head of behavioral science at Frog.
For Matt, a key source of inspiration for his work at Frog comes from the pages of science fiction.
The applied behavioral science process that we use at Frog is derived from my work, and my work starts with a behavioral statement. So when a target audience who has some limitations wants to motivation, they will behavior as measured by data. That's a really specific articulation of who will be doing what and why, and then how are we measuring that, and who's outside of the scope of this project. That's what we're starting with here at Frog. My book is called Start at the End for a reason. We want to articulate the world as we want it to be at the end of this process. And that's where we should start with our clients. Like, what are our clients trying to make true in the world? We then need to go through a research step. And this is also a new skill for Frog. Frog has always done research, right? It's been an important part of the Frog research tradition. However, a lot of the research that we have tended to do in the world is what we might think of as foundational research or contextual research, right? I'm trying to ground myself in the space of the problem. And that's really valuable. But in behavioral science, we're doing a really specific kind of research. We are doing quant and qual. We always use both quantitative methods and qualitative methods. We want a mixed methods approach because that's going to give us a more stable truth. The best analogy I've ever found for it is sort of science fiction. And so that makes Frog a really interesting place to be. They've always inhabited the world of the imagined and then made that true. And that's the first step for us, right? So, if you think about science fiction as an analogy for behavioral science, we first have to articulate the world that we want in really specific behavioral terms. If there is this world we want, we're going to imagine our science fiction universe here that we want, this potential future. Why would anyone want to live there? Why is it attractive? Why does it have gravity? Why does it pull us towards it? We often refer to those as promoting pressures, things that make that behavior more likely in the world. And then given that it's attractive, why don't we already live there? What do we need to do to make it easier for that to happen? So we refer to those as inhibiting pressures, the things that push back, that pull away from that future universe. And so by understanding those really rigorously, by looking at people in the world, we can start to address them. We use a paradigm of mine called always, never, sometimes, started, stopped. So rather than starting with typical design personas where I might come in and say, okay, well, gender matters, or, I'm going to go create age matters, some demographic thing. Instead, what I do is I always start and ground myself in those 5 key behavioral targets. Started, people who just started doing the thing. Stopped, so people who used to do it but don't do it anymore. And then people who are stable. They never do it or rarely do it. They sometimes do it, or they always and often do it. So always, never, sometimes, started, stopped. And then we look at the differences in pressures. And so once we understand that, right, there's a really big difference between what we would go build, but we don't know which of those is the right intervention until we go out into the world and start to understand these pressures. And once we think we know how to do that, right, we've done some research, we go through a design step to say, hey, what are all the ways to maximize these promoting pressures and minimize these inhibiting pressures? Then we have to go pilot that in the world. That's we've done observational science in the research portion. Now we need to do experimental science, right? We have to try. We have to say, hey, I'm going to do this thing and see if it actually results in the behavior change that I want, that I set up at the very beginning, right? Remember in that first step, I said, people are going to do what, why, and here's how I'm going to measure it. Well, great. How can I test that? Do people do what, why? Because of this measurement that I've previously agreed on. And so it's been a wonderful experience bringing that to Frog. We are doing it, anytime you're trying to affect change within an organization, there's some promoting pressures and some inhibiting pressures. The lovely thing about behavioral science is that it is sort of a universal tool.
In the year that Matt has been at Frog, he's devoted himself to building a thriving behavioral science practice, regularly training colleagues and clients alike in applying the principles of behavioral science to the creative process.
I'm teaching classes, so at this point we've taught over 100 Frogs, a 5-week course on behavioral science where we're actually working every week pretty in depth to go through this together and give them some practical hands-on experience. Look, at 100 people, I think that's probably the most behavioral science trained people in one place in any agency in the world, as far as I know. That's a big cohort. But if you measure that against the demand of the world for behavior change and then things that we need to do in the world to create the behavior change that we want, it's a relatively small staff in some ways. The way we teach behavioral science, it works at any scale. So what do I mean by that? You can use it to change the population of the world, right? Like, how do we tackle behaviors that prevent climate change and create a sustainable and regenerative future? All the way down to yourself. You can use behavioral science to understand your own behaviors and get yourself to go to the gym or eat right or whatever it is that you need to do in the world. That's a wonderful gift to give somebody, is something that they can apply at more than one level. Finding something that people feel like, hey, I can grapple with this at more than one level, I think is helpful because they can see how they would use it in their own life. I think for any teaching thing, you want to try and get to something where somebody feels like they have immediate competency, where they can at least try to apply this very quickly. I don't have to wait a year. 100% of the more than 100 frogs that we've trained have said, I will use this on a current or future project. That's huge. People feel how they can do it. And that's what you want. You want people to not just walk away going, it was fun and interesting, but I know how I can do something about it. And so I think that that's been a big part internally of the interest.
While behavioral science is a relatively new field, there are two specific industries that have been early adopters of its principles.
There are two industries that have always been early movers in behavioral science, and those are health and finance. Both health and finance have behaviors that happen a lot. So, if you think about a behavior that happens only once a year, it's relatively hard to change because you have very few sort of shots on target. Finance and health behaviors occur every single day, all of the time. And so there's relatively more potential for behavior change. They also are places where those industries have created models that directly monetize behavior change. This is really important, right? So if you think of everything exists to change behavior, business is just monetized behavior change. And so because they have business models that directly benefit when you benefit, it's easier to apply behavioral science. And so those have always been the two early ones. We also, government's another place, right? Working on projects like, if you're the government, you care a lot about closing the Black American home ownership gap. Okay, that's a very behavioral science amenable project, right? Because it happens at scale. There are specific behaviors that need to happen from different actors in that environment. I think venture design and behavioral science are a really great coupling and pairing. So if you think about where behavioral science shines, ideally we're getting to a behavioral statement, who is going to be doing what and why. And if you're a long-standing existing business, you're Uber or Nike or something, you kind of know who it is you want to do what, and you're not sure how to make that happen, right? Behavioral science is really good at filling in that how. Venture design is this really interesting process that I think comes before behavioral science, which is you don't always know the who, the what, and the why, right? Sometimes you just know a who, right? You said, hey, here's an underserved market opportunity. I don't really know their motivations, and I really don't even know what I want them to do yet, but I know that they're underserved in this generalized way. So there's this whole interesting piece of strategic work that can come before behavioral science about figuring out that who or that what or that why. Or sometimes you know the what, I have this new technology, but I don't know who would use it or why. I just know I have this new technology. And so I go out into the world and understand whose needs it meets, like what their motivations are.
A major recurring theme of Matt's behavioral science practice at Frog has been around sustainability, both in terms of reducing harm to the environment and promoting lasting, sustained change. It's something he's been working on with Kara Pecknold, Frog's global sustainability lead.
A lot of great projects coming to Frog around how do we create sustainable behaviors in the world. Really nice mashups with my colleague Kara. And we mean that two ways, both behavior change that creates sustainability and regeneration in the world, but also behavior change that's sustainable. It doesn't do me any good to, get you to do something for a day, right? I need behavior change that continues over time. And so I have to think inherently about, what is something that doesn't just burn you out. Diets are a great example of this, right? Pretty easy to get somebody to follow a crash diet for 2 weeks. It's a lot harder to get them to make permanent life changes that will change their health. And then there's been a lot of internal behavior change stuff for companies, right? As they grapple with this next evolution, which is, in some ways triggered by COVID and everybody goes to the sort of remote work version. But I think it's a lot more than that. I think for a lot of people, they are now demanding something really different from their work. Indeed, I'm demanding something really, really different from my work. And I think that has opened up opportunities for lots of internal behavior change. And so this sort of ability for people in a really hot job market to shift what they're doing because of their own internal beliefs creates lots of opportunity for behavior change.
We're going to take a short break. When we return, Matt will share more about some of the limits of applied behavioral science.
Hi, I'm Bethany Brown, Associate Director of Service Design at Frog. It's strange how something so ubiquitous can be so misunderstood. But this is the way for services that impact our daily lives, from buying groceries to paying bills to accessing healthcare. At Frog, we partnered with Savannah College of Art and Design and the Service Design Network to uncover the state of service design in the United States. Check today's show notes to download the new research report. Find out where all service designers are hiding, what they're working on, and what's next for the practice.
Now back to Matt Wallaert, author of Start at the End and head of behavioral science at Frog.
I think everyone who does this work eventually realizes how bad they are. I think you can know all you want about how the human mind works, and you can know all you want about how to change behavior, and you will still fail. I am an imperfect father, and an imperfect romantic partner, and an imperfect manager, and an imperfect behavioral scientist. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a first-gen college kid, and my dad and I are very close. And, sometimes in our more reflective moments, he'll articulate that he can recognize that what I do, that the examined life that I live, that the way that I do things in the world might not set me up for happiness all of the time. You can recognize methods for making change and still not be able to make it happen. And I think doing this work, if you're doing it well, you're sort of doomed to a career of failure. So what do I mean by that? Like, good science requires failure. If you never create an intervention that doesn't change the behavior that you wanted, then all that's happening is you're manipulating the target. You're moving the target so that your arrow hits it, right? Like, if you never miss, you've moved the target. I joined the startup called Thrive, founded by a guy named Avi Karnani and Ori Schnapps. We did a really good job at getting people to save money and budget and do all these things. But when I started looking into the data, we missed a huge problem, which is that there is a ethnicity and gender wage gap in this country and worldwide. Okay, so we did this amazing job of helping people change their financial lives, but we totally missed this other thing. And so we were successful, but we were also very much a failure in some ways. And so then we created the second thing called Get Raised, which was about helping women and people who were underpaid go ask for and get a raise and get to a place where they could get more money. And, over the last 10 years, and I think over that 10-year period, we helped women earn something like $3.5 billion, $4 billion in raises. I mean, it was a big deal. But even that's a failure, right? Like, it's successful in a sense. Women got money. Great. That's what we want. We closed the wage gap. Great. That's what we want. But we did it by women having to go out of their way to do something that they shouldn't have to do. Women should be paid fairly in the first place. They changed the behavior of the wrong person. And so then I have to go off and, I started building all these things around how do I get men to do things differently? How to get men to go to gender-focused events? How do I get men to look at competency differently? And everything you do, it's going to open up a whole new world of fix that problem, but there's infinitely more problems. And certainly there have been lots of opportunities in my career where companies that I think of as fairly terrible have come to me and said, yeah, let's do this thing. And I'm like, no, and hang up the phone, right? But I can't stop some other behavioral scientist from doing it. I can't stop that company from doing it. And that's true of, I think, any powerful method. There's the sort of hackneyed, with great power comes great responsibility, sort of Spider-Man version of it.
Understanding how to change behaviors requires first understanding what a behavior even is. In Matt's practice at Frog, his focus is on behaviors that are physically observable.
I am trying to change things at scale for people. What I mean is physically observable behaviors. If you look at the behavioral statement, right, that very last piece is measured by something. I have to measure it some way. And so, we get in this discussion with clients sometimes where they're like, okay, well, I want people to love my product. Cool, what do you mean? I don't know what love is, but I want you to show me. I don't know what that means. Do you want people to buy your product, recommend your product, use your product? There's a lot of different versions of what that love is. And look, I have a 6-year-old. Love is ineffable. I do love that guy, right? But I also express my love for that guy. I give him a hug. I tell him I love him. I support him. There are behaviors that we have to go do in the world. Behavior for me, in the context we're talking about, is physically observable. I wrote a book that's very much, it's a business book and it's fun to read, but it is in many ways a manual about in an applied way, how do you do this? This is really different. There's a lot of social psychology books that are what we call phenomenological. So they're studies that were done in a lab, and maybe they have some theory behind them, but they're demonstrations of biases or concepts or something that we think is happening in the human brain. And I don't dispute the reality of those findings, but the world is very complex and people are very complex. And so, if you go just apply things that worked in the lab blindly into the world, they don't work that often, right? They need customization and nuance to work in the world. I love the sort of Mary Poppins, well begun is half done kind of version of this. If you can do the behavioral statement really well, if you really explore what is it you truly mean by that behavior at the beginning of a project, the rest of the project just tends to fall into place because you stay really aligned. You've got this statement. It's articulated in a formal way. You can put it on the wall. You have this North Star that you can refer back to at all times. I think about something like love, where, one of those ineffable human experiences that we've just grappled over and over and over with for time. And I think we'll just keep grappling with, right? Like there'll always be better ways to explore that topic and what it means and how we can say it. And all of it builds off, all fiction builds off previous fiction. And so I don't think there's a state where behavioral science is just done. I think we just keep going.
So much of our everyday behaviors, from the decisions we make to the way we react to things, are patterns that seem so automatic, we rarely investigate them. So shining a lens on these patterns through the frame of behavioral science can be a bit daunting. But for Matt, change is a path to progress, not perfection. During our conversation, Matt shared how his own behaviors have changed and how he's continuing to embrace behavior change in his life.
As I mentioned earlier, I struggled with an eating disorder when I was in high school. And, I'm better with my lumps than I used to be. I think the thing that's changed for me is I'm actually a lot more tolerant of the foibles of others. I think as a young person, it's really easy to hold people to this unattainable standard of rightness. And I probably still do that. My standards for people are maybe still higher than they need to be. But I've become a lot kinder about other people's, in air quotes, imperfections. I'm not sure that they're in fact imperfections. I think maybe the imperfection is in me, the perceiver. My mom will tell stories from when I was a kid about incidents of, where my orientation towards inclusion and diversity and justice came from at very, very early ages. Even if I morally believed them, even if I wanted them systemically in the world, I'm not sure I was always kind to the people in my life in the same way. I think you can do great good and care a lot about diversity and inclusion in the world and not create a diverse, inclusive environment in your own world, whether that's being friends with you, whether that's in your household or in your family. And so that's, as I turn 40, where I try to spend my time is thinking about for work, I try and fight this fight every single day. But then I go home and try and think about how do I make this a warmer, gentler, kinder place for the people around me? Because I can do this thing, I can explain behavioral science, I can explain things in the world. People are like, oh, you're very outgoing. You must be very extroverted. And, there's a version of extroversion. One of the ways we talk about extroversion and introversion in psychology is where do you get your energy? So if you're feeling low energy, do you gravitate towards other people or away? And I am very much an introvert. I grew up in very rural Oregon. I like my space, right? If I'm upset, I don't really want to talk to anybody. If I'm feeling low energy, I don't really want to talk to anybody. But I don't think that that's because of the gregariousness, because of the loquaciousness, because of part of my, sort of work persona is this communicative piece. It's hard for people to see that sometimes. I'm moving from New York, where I've been for many, many years, to San Diego, where we sort of inadvertently spent about 18 months in the pandemic. And I like who I am in San Diego a lot better because there's more opportunities for me to just get in the ocean and go surfing and be away from people for a bit and maybe just, quiet some of those internal storms a little to be a better dad and a better scientist and a better human and, a better applied scientist.
That's our show. The Design Mind Frogcast was brought to you by Frog, a leading global creative consultancy that is part of Capgemini Invent. Check today's show notes for transcripts and more from our conversation. We really want to thank Matt Wallaert, head of behavioral science at Frog, for sharing so much of his practice and his own perspective on human behavior. We also want to thank you, dear listener. If you like what you heard, tell your friends. Rate and review to help others find us, and be sure to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. Find lots more to think about from our Global Frog team at frog.co/designmind. That's frog.co. Follow Frog on Twitter at @frogdesign and @frog_design on Instagram. And if you have any thoughts about the show, we'd love to hear from you. Reach out at frog.marketing@frogdesign.com. Thanks for listening. Now go make your mark.